The concourse of Los Angeles International Airport buzzed like a disturbed beehive on that gray autumn morning. A fine drizzle, painting the windows in muted tones, seemed to echo David's somber mood. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, but weariness weighed on his broad shoulders like an invisible burden. His worn backpack and faded baseball jacket made him just another face in the hurried crowd, an anonymous figure in a sea of strangers. The announcement for United Airlines Flight 127 to Chicago pierced the air, calling for boarding. David, man in his early 40s with a face etched by sorrow and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, moved with a sluggishness that sharply contrasted with the frantic energy around him. The empty wheelchair by his side, which he pushed with his free hand, was a cruel, constant reminder of his mother's absence. The aroma of stale coffee and the clatter of rolling luggage on the polished marble floor mingled with his own anguish, forming a cacophony in his mind. He had just bid farewell to her at the cemetery under an equally somber sky, and the journey home was a desperate attempt to flee the pain, but it felt deeply rooted in his chest. Upon reaching the gate, the economy. Class boarding lines snaked like a human labyrinth. David waited patiently, clutching the crumpled boarding pass in his hand. Finally, as he approached the aircraft door, a middle-aged flight attendant with an impeccable bun and a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes greeted him. "Good morning, sir. Your seat is 23A," she recited, her gaze already drifting to the next passenger, completely overlooking the folded wheelchair. David offered a silent nod, his throat tight. He tried to maneuver the chair into the narrow aisle, but it was a clumsy ballet of angles and obstructions. Other passengers, laden with carry-ons, jostled past him, their hurried whispers and sighs of impatience audible. A flush crept up David's neck. He leaned into the flight attendant's space, his voice rough with emotion. "Excuse me," he started. "Where can I store this?" He gestured towards the wheelchair, a silent plea in his eyes. The flight attendant, now preoccupied with directings. "A family down the aisle," barely registered his words. "Please keep moving, sir." "We're running late," she retorted, her voice clipped, her attention already elsewhere. A bitter wave of frustration washed over David. He wasn't trying to be difficult, but the wheelchair was important. It represented his mother, her final days, and his devotion. He raised his voice slightly, a quiet desperation creeping in. "I need help with the wheelchair. It's essential." It was then that a younger male flight attendant, with a lean build and an air of simmering impatience, stepped forward. His eyes, devoid of warmth, met David's only briefly. "Sir, if you can't get settled, we'll have to ask you to deplane. We have a schedule to maintain." His tone was sharp, devoid of any understanding. David felt the hot sting of humiliation. His grief, already a heavy burden, was now compounded by this public dismissal. He gripped the handle of the wheelchair, his knuckles white. For a moment, he considered simply walking away, abandoning the flight and the painful journey home. But then, a quiet defiance stirred within him. This wasn't just about his inconvenience. It was about the fundamental right to be treated with respect, to be seen. He took a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze hardening with a newfound resolve. With a silent sigh of resignation, David finally wrestled himself and the folded wheelchair into the confines of seat 23A. The chair leaned precariously against the seat in front, an awkward, silent sentinel. He carefully tucked his worn backpack under the seat, trying to shrink himself, to become as invisible as possible. The plane shuddered to life, the low rumble of the engines a prelude to their ascent, and a jarring soundtrack to his internal turmoil. He stared out the window, watching the terminal lights recede, a blur of fractured colors in the pre-dawn gloom, mirroring the chaos within him. The same flight attendant who had dismissed him earlier glided down the aisle, offering pre-flight drinks. When she reached David's row, she paused, her gaze briefly flicking to the folded wheelchair as if it were an inconvenient obstacle. "Anything for you, sir?" she asked, her voice a flat, unengaging drone. "Just water, please," David replied, his voice barely a whisper, the simmering anger carefully concealed beneath his quiet demeanor. She handed him a small plastic cup, her hand brushing his with cool indifference, and moved on, her attention already consumed by the next row. David took a slow sip of the tasteless water, his mind replaying the humiliating exchange at the gate. He wasn't an unreasonable man. He understood the relentless pressures of air travel, the need for rigid efficiency, but the coldness, the outright dismissal of his simple, desperate request had cut deep. It spoke volumes about a pervasive lack of empathy, a basic human decency that felt increasingly scarce in the hurried pace of modern life. He spent the first hour of the flight lost in the labyrinth of his own thoughts, the monotonous drone of the engines, a constant companion to his grief. He thought of his mother, her gentle smile, her unwavering strength, even as her body withered. The wheelchair wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was a sacred vessel that had carried her, a symbol of her struggle, her dignity, and his own unwavering commitment to her care. To have it treated with such callous indifference felt like a profound, personal affront, a disrespect to her memory. Mid-flight, a subtle tremor began. It was a gentle undulation at first, then escalated into sharp, jarring jolts that made the entire plane shudder. Passengers gasped, some clutching their armrests, as if tethering themselves to safety. Flight attendants scrambled, their composure briefly slipping as they secured loose items and moved swiftly through the aisles. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm, advising everyone to remain seated and keep their seatbelts securely fastened. David remained outwardly calm, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him, his thoughts miles away. He had faced far worse storms in his life, both literal and metaphorical, and this physical turbulence felt almost trivial compared to the emotional tempest within him. As the turbulence intensified, a small child in the road directly in front of him began to cry, his high-pitched wails echoing through the cabin, a raw expression of fear. His mother, visibly distressed, tried to comfort him, her murmurs lost in the escalating cries. David watched, a flicker of an idea, a tiny spark of purpose beginning to form in the depths of his weariness. He looked at the distraught mother, then at the terrified child, and then his gaze shifted to the indifferent, seemingly oblivious crew. A quiet yet firm decision crystallized within him. The turbulence eventually subsided, leaving a lingering sense of unease in the cabin, a subtle tremor that permeated the air. The flight attendants, looking a little flustered and disheveled, began to resume their service, offering a new round of drinks and pre-packaged snacks. The young flight attendant, who had been rude earlier, approached David's row, his eyes still, avoiding direct contact. He seemed to shrink slightly as he reached David's seat. "Anything else, sir?" he mumbled, his voice flat, his gaze fixed somewhere over David's shoulder. David looked at him directly, his eyes holding a depth that belied his quiet demeanor. "Yes, actually," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, cutting through the ambient hum of the cabin. "I'd like to speak with the senior flight attendant or the purser, please." The young man's eyebrows, subtly, almost imperceptibly, arched. A flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of annoyance, crossed his face. "Is there a problem, sir?" he asked, a defensive edge creeping into his tone. "There is," David replied, his gaze unwavering, his voice still low, but carrying an undeniable weight. "And I'd prefer to discuss it with someone in charge. This is not a trivial matter." A few tense minutes later, the senior flight attendant, the same woman who had met him at the gate, approached his seat. She had a strained, almost brittle smile on her face, likely anticipating a trivial complaint about the turbulence or a forgotten beverage. She positioned herself slightly above him, maintaining a subtle power dynamic. "Good afternoon, sir. I understand you wish to speak with me?" she asked, her tone professional, almost rehearsed, but still lacking any genuine warmth. Her eyes scanned the cabin as if already eager to move on. David reached into his worn backpack, the fabric slightly frayed at the edges, and pulled out a small, meticulously preserved leather wallet. He opened it with a deliberate slowness and carefully extracted a laminated card, its edges softened by time. He extended it to her, his hand steady. He didn't utter a single word, instead choosing to watch her face intently as her eyes scanned the text. Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly at first, then abruptly, dramatically. Her professional smile faltered, crumbling away to be replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated shock. She read the card again, her lips moving silently, as if to confirm the words, then her gaze snapped to David, her carefully maintained composure utterly shattered. Her eyes darted to the folded wheelchair resting beside him, then back to the card, and finally returned to David's tired, knowing eyes. "Oh, oh my goodness," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to her earlier clipped tones. I had no idea. Sir, please accept my sincerest apologies. We truly didn't know." Her hand holding the card trembled slightly. The young flight attendant, who had lingered nearby, his curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in the atmosphere, also caught a fleeting glimpse of the card. His face instantly drained of color, turning a sickly white. He looked as if he'd seen a ghost, his earlier arrogance replaced by a palpable sense of dread. The senior flight attendant, her face now a mask of mortification, quickly excused herself. She walked briskly, almost running, towards the front of the cabin, the laminated card still clutched tightly in her trembling hand. A low murmur began to spread through the nearby rows as other passengers, sensing the sudden dramatic shift in atmosphere, leaned forward, their eyes following her departure. David just sat there, a quiet, almost imperceptible triumph in his eyes. He hadn't sought recognition, hadn't craved applause, but sometimes recognition was the only catalyst that could truly instigate change. Within what felt like mere seconds, the senior flight attendant returned, her face still pale, now accompanied by the captain himself. Captain Miller was a man in his late 50s with a calm, authoritative demeanor and a distinguished gray at his temples. His face, however, held a hint of genuine concern, a rare sight for passengers. He extended his hand to David, his grip firm and respectful. "Mr. Thompson, I am Captain Miller." "It's an honor to have you on board, sir," he said, his voice deep, resonating with sincerity. He then turned, his gaze encompassing the senior flight attendant and the young attendant who stood beside her, their heads bowed slightly. "I've just been made aware of the situation. Please, both of you, accept my deepest apologies on behalf of the entire airline. This is absolutely not how we treat our passengers, especially those who have served our country with such extraordinary distinction." The senior flight attendant's face was flushed crimson with embarrassment, her earlier composure entirely abandoned. "Mr. Thompson, I am truly, profoundly sorry for my behavior at the gate and during the flight. We had no idea you were a Medal of Honor recipient. And the wheelchair, we should have been more attentive, more compassionate." Her voice trembled slightly, a hint of tears in her eyes. The young flight attendant, looking utterly mortified, his earlier insolence replaced by stark humility, stepped forward. "Sir, I was completely out of line. I apologize for my rudeness and impatience. There's no excuse for how I acted." His voice was barely a whisper filled with genuine regret. David nodded slowly, acknowledging their heartfelt apologies. He looked at their contrite faces, sensing the genuine remorse. "It's all right," he said, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with a gentle, profound authority that commanded attention. "I understand you have a demanding job under constant pressure, but kindness, a little empathy, a moment of understanding, it goes a long way. This wheelchair," he gestured to it, a melancholic expression softening his features. "Belonged to my mother. She passed away recently. Caring for her, seeing her through her final days, taught me a great deal about patience and the immense importance of seeing beyond the surface, beyond what's immediately apparent." Captain Miller listened intently, his expression grave, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding. "Mr. Thompson, your words resonate deeply with me, and I'm sure with my crew. We strive for excellence in service, for compassion in every interaction. But clearly, we fell short today. Your feedback is not just invaluable, it's a critical lesson. I assure you we will address this internally, profoundly, to ensure no other passenger experiences such a profound lack of consideration." He then looked at the senior flight attendant and the young attendant, his gaze firm but encouraging. "This is a learning moment for all of us. Let's remember the true meaning of service, the human element of what we do." For the remainder of the flight, the crew's demeanor towards David underwent a remarkable, almost palpable transformation. They were attentive, genuinely respectful, and solicitous, their earlier coldness replaced by warmth. The purser personally offered him a first-class meal, which David politely declined, opting for the regular service, not wanting special treatment. He did notice the senior flight attendant discreetly offering an extra blanket and a kind word to the grieving mother and her child, a small yet significant gesture of newfound empathy. As the plane began its gradual descent into O'Hare International Airport, the captain made a special, unscripted announcement, not explicitly mentioning David, but emphasizing the paramount importance of respect, understanding, and compassion for all passengers, particularly those who carry hidden burdens or who have made significant sacrifices. It was a subtle yet powerful acknowledgement, a silent apology whispered across the cabin to the quiet passenger in seat 23A. When the aircraft finally touched down, the flight attendants made sure David was the first to deplane, personally assisting him with the wheelchair, their movements gentle and considerate. As he stepped off the plane, feeling the cool, crisp Chicago air on his face, David looked back at the crew, his gaze meeting theirs. The senior flight attendant offered him a genuine, heartfelt smile this time, a deep line of regret still etched around her eyes, but softened by renewed respect. He returned it, a flicker of peace in his own eyes. He had boarded this flight carrying the heavy burden of grief and frustration. He left with a glimmer of hope, a renewed belief in the profound power of a single moment, a quiet gesture to remind people of their shared humanity. The experience, though painful, had somehow, in its own unexpected way, become a poignant part of his healing journey.